Professor Kuni Kamizaki, who teaches at the School of Community and Regional Planning at UBC and has long been a leader of CLT development in Toronto and Canada through community engaged research, a very interesting role to play in movement building. I hope he will tell you the story of how his workshop project as a student at the U of T. Did I ruin it? Okay, fine. I won't say it then. And since then, he's worked closely, not just with PNLT, but also with the Downtown Eastside Community Land Trust in Vancouver. And I think what I wanted to say most of all is that Kuni's praxis exemplifies the promise of planning academia to contribute to transformative social change. So please join me in welcoming Kuni Kamizaki.
Hello. So first of all, as Catherine mentioned, so please bear with me and Josh today. It's going to be a long day. I mean, the end of the day, so it's not really a long day, but it's long sessions, but it's going to be really, really fun. So I hope you have energy to stay. And then thank you so much again for the introductions. And then really thank you for being here today together. So wonderful to be back at U of T. I'm visiting from Vancouver, which is on unceded territories of Musqueam and Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Before UBC, I also work at U of T a little bit. And also, as Catherine mentioned, I also did my PhD at U of T. And also, I did my master's degree at the U of T. So I'm really, really like U of T. And like Catherine was about to say, but what's really relevant to today's talk is that this idea of building community land trust in Parkdale came out of the planning workshop project at the U of T when I was master's planning students. So I'm sure some of you here as planning students, maybe raise your hand if you're planning students. Okay, great. So I want to say that student projects are so important, so please go ahead. So it's wonderful to talk about history of Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust at U of T. It's kind of full circles. And then my talk today is based on my Metcalf Foundation Fellowship project that I did a research project, and I produced 2 reports. So if you see on the right side that you have QR code that you can download the report. I'm sorry, I'm doing my propaganda here. And to say I'm grateful for the support from the Metcalf Foundations. So in fact, I'm not a Buzzfield visitor like Josh today. So my heartfelt thanks also goes to the Department of Geography and Planning and then Josh for inviting me to be part of this talk at the Buzzfield lecture tonight. And also I should emphasize that Josh and I had a number of conversations this year and then, stimulated a number of interesting ideas together. So I'd like to say my talk today is also informed by my conversation with Josh. So I'd like to discuss transformative potential and limitations of CLTs. And this is important for the discussion. Okay. Sounds okay. Can you hear me? Sorry, I usually speak with a microphone in class, so maybe I speak too much now. Okay, anyway, so this, speak louder now? Okay, mic is not on. So if I come closer, this is better. This much? Sure. Okay, stay there. I won't move. Okay, that sounds good. Okay, so this is a really important discussions because CLTs are growing across Canada and the United States. But then there is a growing concern that CLTs are losing its commitment to pursuing social transformation and building non-capitalist alternatives. And instead, radical potential of CLT is being reduced to a tool for efficient housing supply. This is better. Okay, now I have to do this. Okay, so many technical things, sorry. So instead of radical potential CLTs being reduced to a tool for efficient housing supply. So the question is, how can CLT retain and advance the commitment to social transformations? And I think the experience of PNLTs offers really important insight into these questions. So in my talk, I like to think about this from three perspectives: place, scale, and then properties. And then these are three areas where PNLT have needed to confront structural tensions in the CLT models. And these are the framework that I like to tell the history of the Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust. So my reflection was done in a conversation with PNLT staff, board members, PNLT members, and other CLT colleagues and local partners in Toronto. Many of you are actually here. And in total, I had 27 interviews and 2 focus group discussions. So let me give you a quick overview of PNLT based on acquisitions as organizational milestones. PNLT was established in 2012, and in 2017, PNLT acquired the first land, Milky Way Garden, where newcomer members, particularly Tibetan seniors, have been taking care of the land as an urban agriculture site. In 2019, PNLT succeeded the first preservation of at-risk 15-unit affordable housings. And in 2021, the second one, 36-unit small apartment in Parkdale. And in 2022, the PNLT acquired 82 properties through the transfer from Toronto Community Housings. So within just 10 years from the establishment, PNLT was able to achieve considerable growth of asset holdings. And we tend to pay attention to this expansion by number, which is really important. But a lot of things went in behind these achievements. So that's what I'd like to talk about today more. So let's start with place. And in this section, I will talk about the importance of place-based approach to mobilize the CLT for community-based planning and organizing. So CLTs are non-profit organizations, non-profit community control organizations that acquires, holds, and store the land for community benefit. Central to the CLT's transformative potential is to take property and land out of the speculative market and then put it under community democratic controls. So transformative CLTs lies in the decommodifications and community governance. And broadly speaking, a CLT is a solidarity economy model like cooperatives, such as workers' co-op or credit unions. So the question is, to what extent alternative economic institutions like CLT can contribute to the social change? I take an inspiration from Peter Marcuse on these questions. In this short piece, he asks, whether cooperatives could be an agent of social change. And he raises a warning. The inward-looking tendencies start to permeate cooperatives' day-to-day operation because of the pressure of market competitions. Organizational survival, stability take precedence over a commitment to long-term visions for social transformations. So he argues there is a strong silo effect. As co-ops age, they easily tend to become insulated and as small defensive towers in a landscape not changed by their presence. When Marcuse's discussion focuses on cooperatives, that I think this applies to the CLTs as well. CLT could become depoliticized, get preoccupied with a specific project to take out and possess property, and not getting involved in a local politics and organizing. So they act more as a property-based CLT and could become small defensive towers. So here, CLT's place-based approach is one way to think about this challenge. PNLT was established in Parkdale. Located in West End downtown Toronto, Parkdale is one of the few remaining inner city neighborhoods that are affordable and accessible to low-income and equity-deserving communities. Parkdale has a long history of anti-poverty activism, mutual care, psychiatric survivors movement, and grassroots alternatives to systemic oppressions and exploitations. But at the same time, the Parkdale has been under growing pressures of gentrifications and displacements. So in response to these challenges, PNLT was created as community-driven anti-displacement strategies. And at the beginning, PNLT took an organization of organizations approach where 7 different community-based organizations in Parkdale got together to support PNLTs. So PNLT was built on a long history of place-based organizing in Parkdale. Another important historical background is PNLT was established as a part of bigger solidarity economy initiatives called Parkdale's People's Economies. Under PPE, we had the corporate programs, Alternative Community Currency Program in collaboration with West End Food Corp. We also had a community food procurement initiatives to support community organizations across Toronto, which is now called Food Reach. And so PNLT was positioned as community-based organizations that focuses on the question of land. And retrospectively, this broader framing of PNLT as part of the Solidarity Economy project was really important. Because CLTs are usually associated with producing affordable housing. But since the beginning, PNLT has a comprehensive approach to CLT benefit that include not only affordable rental housing, but also spaces for community economic development, social enterprises, and open space for community uses. So in fact, the first acquisition was Milky Way Garden, which reinforced the broader role of PNLT beyond housing in the neighborhood. And moreover, PNLT has been able to harness the CLT model to act as a vehicle for community-based planning in Parkdale, which is a counterpoint to real estate-driven city plannings. For example, in 2015 and 2016, PNLT co-led a neighborhood-wide planning project in collaboration with over 25 local organizations and hundreds of residents to develop the Parkdale neighborhood plan. This planning process was important for PNLT because the process embedded the PNLT's organizational growth into neighborhood-wide community organizing and community priorities, positioning PNLT as a place-based CLTs. And for PNLT, this neighborhood plan generated a number of key community directions for action that PNLT has been undertaking even to date. One of the challenges that we identified from the planning process was the ongoing loss of rooming houses, the most affordable options for the vulnerable low-income tenants. PNLT undertook community action research to better understand the issue of ongoing loss of rooming houses. And PNLT worked with rooming house tenants as community-based researchers. And the study results showed over 800 tenants were facing immediate threat of evictions and homelessness, demonstrating the urgency to take actions. So it's really crucial that this research project propose a solution that is a community-led preservation of the at-risk rooming houses. And these research findings help convince the City of Toronto to do a pilot project on the rooming house preservations. So all this effort went into the first acquisition of the rooming house in 2019. So undertaking community-based planning and research based on the naming the moment approach has been central to PNLTs. Not many CLT do this kind of planning, but it's critical to take the CLT beyond their day-to-day organizational boundaries. Dodgery Street Neighborhood Initiative in Boston's, Cooper Square CLT in New York, or Corporation Jackson's are some of those examples. For them, community-led alternative plan is a political leverage, and it is a collective vision in which CLT is embedded as a mechanism to implement that visions. So this relationship between a CLT and a place is critical. So for PNLT, Parkdale is not a simple background stage, but it's a co-constitutive of the PNLT's place-based work. So the question of place cannot be separated from the question of scale. So next, I'd like to discuss how PNLT redefine the meaning of scaling as a political mobilizations. The scale question figures centrally for CLTs. When PNLT was working on the acquisition of the Milky Way Garden, Parkdale was experiencing the wave of housing financializations and intensified pressure of displacement. And it was clear that removing one land from the real estate market would not stop the structural challenges of gentrifications and financialization. Similarly, when PNLT succeeded with the first rooming house preservations, we continue to see ongoing loss of rooming houses and evictions in Parkdale. So this is an example of the challenges that grassroots CLT often face. And grassroots CLTs are initiated to respond to issues of displacement, but they are often regarded as too small to influence the broader issues because they are seen lacking enough scale. So conventional response is, okay, let's scale up by increasing the number of units in the property possessions. And it is important to acknowledge that the more property CLT bring under community land ownership stewardship, the more power the CLT can build, right? But then this conventional framing of scaling itself raises some questions for CLTs. As I mentioned earlier, there isn't a concern that the CLTs are losing the commitment to social transformation. And one of the forces behind that is the pressure to scale up, because it requires building technical capacity in real estate, ensuring the financial sustainability, and expanding the organizations or geographic service areas. And all these are really essential work of the CLTs. But the challenge is sometimes these may be achieved at the expense of community organizing, tenant leadership, and democratic governance. But again, if we do not act, we would see more loss of affordable housing, more people losing homes. So this is a conundrum that grassroots CLT really need to face. So to think about this challenge, I move away from the understanding of scaling only as an almost synonymous with the quantitative scale of asset ownership, market shares, or economies of scale. But instead of this economistic view, I would approach scale as a political and a geographic concept. So for example, when I say a place-based approach earlier, I do not mean to suggest a naive localism where local action alone would solve structural challenges. But instead, as geographers Dory Massey and Gillian Hurt suggest, we need to take this politics of place seriously. What I mean is that the local place is not a fixed, demarcated unit, but it's a spatial node of connections with other places and wider political economies at the multiple scales. So scaling can be considered as increasing political power or relational autonomy by changing those extra local connections with other places and institutions. And in fact, according to those involved in PNLT, what it means to scale for grassroots CLT is experience more than quantitative growth. For them, the meaning of scaling is rather political mobilizations. I'll give you 2 examples to illustrate this meaning. The first, PNLT spearheaded the community-driven policy work. Despite the PNLT's first successful rooming house preservation in 2019, there was no acquisition program after that. So PNLT still needed to compete against market actors. So PNLT conducted a policy research, proposed and advocated for acquisition funding program, which now many of us know as multi-unit residential acquisition programs, MIRA. So the importance of the MIRA was, so to speak, to level the playing field for the PNLT locally. But this policy win is not just a local win for Parkdale. Interestingly, if we look back around 2020, the dominant housing policy discourse at the time was new housing supply, which is still true. But housing preservation wasn't on the radars. So when City of Toronto created the MIRA program in 2020, it also challenged the dominant policy narrative on supply, right? So this policy work is also about building a broader framework for removing land and property from speculative market and instituting the community control across multiple places. So one interviewee see this impact, this whole idea of acquisition funds expanded tremendously in Toronto and in a number of provinces. All out of these little things that were trying to solve a very specific problem in a very specific place. So second example would be PNLT's movement building work. So PNLT has been key role in building the CLT movement in Toronto and across Canada. For the latter, PNLT has supported the creation of the national Canadian network of CLTs. And in Toronto, the relationship is more direct. The PNLT supported the first acquisition of the Kensington Market CLT back in 2021. And there have been a knowledge sharing and a mutual learning with Circle CLT, Chinatown Land Trust, Little Jamaica CLTs, and many others in Toronto. So in Toronto, we are seeing the growth of many neighborhood-based CLT based on active interdependence among CLTs. Some critics still regard this growth of neighborhood-based CLT as a sign of inefficiencies and dispersions. And this view often favors one large-scale CLT, echoing more conventional view on scaling. But however, PNLT's commitment to creating enabling conditions for other CLT show that scaling can be achieved collectively as a CLT movement. A PNLT board members see scaling differently too. It's that the shift in the scale that I think we've been able to achieve, not just in our own internal organizational capacity, but in influencing the broader perception of the CLTs in downtown Toronto, in Southern Ontario, and in Canada. And this practice echoes emerging vision from other politically engaged CLTs, such as those in New York and California. And this is a kind of statement from the California CLTs. CLT scale is about more than numbers. Grassroots CLTs are a part of the racial economic justice movements, and it should be understood as one tool that can be used to address toxic dynamic between the speculative market and its extraction of wealth from indigenous land, Black and brown bodies, immigrant workers, and from poor and working class neighborhood. Instead of measuring success strictly through the housing production numbers, we should measure scale and impact holistically. So like this, PNLT's experience also shows that the scaling can be building political power through multi-scalar political engagement, grounded in policy work and in movement buildings. I should also remind that PNLT's reframing of scaling as political mobilizations cannot be separated from the more conventional form of scalings that PNLT achieved by asset holdings. And the PNLT has really greatly used the economic power to build the political powers. So what we need to pay attention to is this type of scaling comes with challenges. And these challenges have surfaced contradiction of the CLT model that the PNLT has needed to confront. That is the entanglement with the property regime in the context of settler colonialism. And that's the third idea that I like to cover. This inherent contradiction of the model became clear when PNLT could not avoid the eviction of our own tenants. Just to be clear, these evictions were not driven by economic interests like private landlords would do to maximize profit. PNLT's case had more to do with a non-profit housing management practice to address complex situations, such as when individual tenants' action could put other tenants in a building in dangers. So PNLT needed to intervene to ensure community-wide well-being and safety. This is a very complex, as some interviewees acknowledge. There's not much else nonprofit can do in this kind of situation, but to resort evictions. And then one staff also suggests that this tension is related to legal responsibility as a charities. We would love to say there's just no justification for any eviction at all because we provide affordable housing, but we are registered charity and we hold these assets, and then we are by law prohibited from making decisions that risk our ability to hold this asset in trust. We can't actually adopt this no eviction policy right now because it would tie our hands with respect to fiduciary responsibilities. So my intention of discussing this issue of eviction is not so much to critique PNLT's actions. My intention is to interrogate a broader questions that the eviction raises, that is a CLT's entanglement with the property ownership regime. And this may be obvious to some, but this complexity calls for rethinking the meaning of transformative potential of the CLTs. In PNLT's experience, this contradiction is captured in the question raised by one board members. How do we not replicate the problem that we came in to solve, such as evictions? We are grappling with the complex identity issues about from fighting landlord to being a landlord. PNLT started as a struggle against displacement. And PNLT is trying to challenge the property regime that structures unequal power relations between the landlords and the tenants. But PNLTs and many other CLT too are maintaining it by participating in a system of property ownership. Of course, for PNLT, it is a common property, it's not the private property, so to speak. Yet, as legal geographer Nicholas Blomley notes, eviction is a legal enforcement of the property relations. And the property relations are unequal power relations. And then property relations are conduits through which state power comes into effect to regulate grassroots action like PNLTs. And I would say this challenge is related to the bigger, important question raised by planning scholar Libby Porters. The struggle against dispossession too easily becomes struggle for possessions. The task of removing land from the capitalist market can be transformative. But CLTs ensure decommodification by changing the ways of owning and possessing. But as Porter warns, community-led acquisitions, the scaling up could risk becoming just seeking more property possessions. And this is a challenge that many grassroots CLT with background in organizing and activism really anticipate to deal with when they start. So as one step reflect, bringing the land under community ownership is the first step on a staircase that is very large. It's almost like we open the door at the bottom of the staircase. And implications of more property possessions are huge because CLT work in the context of capitalism and settler colonialism. In her important essays, What is Planning with the Properties, Heather Dorius argues that colonization does not simply concern the acquisition of territories. It also participates in the creation of the property itself, and possession must be regarded as an effect of dispossessions. So transforming the land into properties as commodities and object of possession is central to the workings of capitalism and settler colonialism. So just increasing access to the racial property regime would fail to transform it. So in this sense, property will be always inadequate category for social transformations. So for CLT, therefore, just removing the property and changing ownership is not enough if we like to pursue social transformations in a more decolonial and anti-colonial directions. Then question for us is, if more possession is not the end goal of the struggle against dispossession, then what does the opposite of dispossession mean to CLTs? To think about these questions, an important inspiration comes from the Leon Simpson, who suggests within the indigenous thought, opposite of dispossession is not possessions. It is a deep, reciprocal, consensual attachment. That is to say, grounded normativity, according to Simpson, and then Glenn Coulter. And a further prompt raised by Heather Dorius in the Planning Without Property is also of a great relevance to CLTs. And I'm going to put it in a kind of CLT context. And is it possible for CLT to pursue practices that affirm connection to place and mode of belonging in ways that do not rely on private property. I think CLT have the potential in grappling with this challenge. And then that hope comes from how CLT model was originally conceptualized. The first CLT, New Communities, Inc., emerged from the US civil rights movement in the 60s as a struggle for land securities and racial and economic justice for Black farmers in Georgia. And a major motivation for creating the CLT as alternative land tenure is to problematize treating land as a commodity and an object of possessions under a property ownership regimes. And it's really important that in the first CLT guide, written by those who developed the New Communities, Inc., they claim the goal of the CLT is to restore the land trust concept rather than initiate it. So this claim derives from the understanding of the various inspirational examples behind CLT model buildings, including indigenous land stewardship. And these practices already existed for a long time, but had been ignored and marginalized. So we can follow this call for restoration of the collective land stewardship. And with this in mind, I am I'm currently exploring the meaning of the opposite of disposition, along with the Downtown Eastside Community Land Trust in Vancouver. Downtown Eastside CLT is led by a community coalition of indigenous communities, low-income SRO, tenant communities, and Japanese Canadian communities. One of the focuses is to preserve and renew SRO hotels into community-owned homes. So my reflection on the PNLT has been done relationally to my learning from Downtown Eastside CLT since I moved to Vancouver. And this work is personally important. Paletugai, or Powell Street area in Downtown Eastside, was home to Japanese Canadians until forced uprooting and then internment during the World War II. So Downtown Eastside CLT is fighting against multiple layers of historical and ongoing processes of dispositions, colonial disposition of the indigenous peoples, dispositions of Japanese Canadians, and then current forces of displacement of the low-income and racialized communities in the Downtown Eastside. So what's guiding Downtown Eastside CLT work and my own thinking is the work of decolonizing governance framework. This work has been led by the president of the Downtown Eastside CLT board, Norm Leach from Stalian Nation, and elders from the host nations and Japanese Canadian communities. And the framework is this, that we use decolonizing rather than decolonized, because no one today knows that what a fully decolonized model looks like, as the colonization has so deeply separated all people from the original collective practices. Instead, we use decolonizing to mean moving away from colonized ways of thinking with understanding that this is an ongoing process. So this approach encourages us to move away from colonial practices, and then move away from colonial practices and then foreground practices that emphasize different relationships with land, healing, and responsibility of caring based on the indigenous worldview and practice. And this framework can serve as a useful guidance to think about the possibility of what's beyond the framework of property possession. And I think about the transformative potential of CLT as a vehicle for transition in a decolonizing directions. So this framework helps open up our attention to practices emerging from PNLTs. And Josh is going to touch upon this more, so I'll show one example. So that is about the transformation of the backyard of one of the rooming houses the PNLT acquired. And this work has been spearheaded by the resident of the building. Previous private landlords did not allow residents to use the backyards at all. So one resident remembered those days, I initially living here felt very unwanted and unwelcome on this property. But after the transition to PNLT, residents were encouraged to animate the backyard space. And this resident felt PNLT is different. Feeling penalties goes beyond providing housing for people, which could be just transactional relations as a tenant and landlord. So she felt penalties trying to create community together. So it is a process of community involvement in deciding and in changing a space that has made a difference in her belonging and attachment to this place. So this member articulated her experience as follows. Penalties are giving a land back to the people, making it more fair for everyone. But I think with that also comes a responsibility for taking care of that land right, making it beautiful, making it enjoyable for everyone. You can use this building as an example with the backyard, an area that we weren't allowed to utilize before. Just like that backyard was literally given back to us just in the process of PNLT buying the buildings. And as you can see, maybe you can see, members have studied the small gardens, and also in the back you see there's a tiki bar where members get together to socialize. And here's a wonderful photos of that kind of socializing happening spontaneously. So I am not saying this is an example of CLT's decolonizations, but I'm sharing this because this is a kind of practice that is often ignored or marginalized when we talk about CLTs. It shows that where we may need to direct our attention beyond the property possession alone. So community land stewardship is not just asset management performed on a discrete property boundaries, but it can be about building a different relationship with land and then transforming how we see ourselves in relation to the world. So I think this shows a good starting place to explore what the opposite of disposition could look like to CLTs. So I'm perfect on time, and so I would like to end my talk with the implication of a radical plannings. So to think, I take an inspiration from Fanak Miraftav. In her essay, Insurgent Practices and Decolonization of the Futures, Miraftav highlights the importance of imagination as a political territories. She argues it is imagination that must be invoked as the last colony, imagination as a political territory, a territory to be occupied to secure closures through totalitarian imagination, or through erasure of alternative imagined futures. The latest subject of colonial occupation then is the ability to imagine a different future, and a struggle for its emancipation is urgent. And I believe this call has become more and more important now. And sometimes it feels really difficult to imagine something different from what it is now. So this is a photo that I took in summer 2016 when PNLT hosted a fundraising event for Milky Way Gardens. As you can see, so many people showed up for the events. And this was the first acquisition by PNLT. I was so excited and then hopeful and thinking, well, CLT is for real, right? But it wasn't like this when we started back in 2012. We were told a number of times that CLT is not going to work, impractical, impossible to buy property in Toronto, that is really expensive. After over 10 years, PNLT shows that the CLT is not only possible, but really powerful to push the limits of what we think is possible, borrowing the phrase from the Peter Marcuse. PNLT is not a perfect, but a hopeful. And this hopeful and transformative imagination of what can be possible is one of the repeated points in my interviews. For example, I think PNLT has acted as a marker of hope of this is possible because it can feel so overwhelming and impossible to abstract and think about it. PNLT has helped us knowing what is a realm of possibilities and extending that farther than what we thought was. Now, here's a key point that I'd like to really emphasize today. This transformative imagination is cultivated through and grounded in actual practice and relationships made through the PNLT's concrete practice. So first, the experience of PNLT shows that CLT can act as a concrete mechanism to produce and ensure basic conditions of living, such as deeply affordable community-owned home. PNLT's housing acquisition is one example that demonstrates the CLT's ability to fight against displacement, respond to immediate needs, and defend the social barriers that are often suppressed. And then second, I also say that PNLT has built something more than immediate. The PNLT's experience shows that there is a potential in producing a different space of emerging practices that shows possibility of living differently, as in examples of the Maynard Burkyard. So this combination of the concrete material change with prefigurative politics is really important because it can keep radical political imaginations alive. And importantly, CLT has a potential of extending this to nurture an alternative reimagination of property and land. So I'd like to thank for CLTs. A point of social transformation is not just about transforming how we own, but transforming how we live, the transformation of everyday life. And a CLT can be a vehicle for transition in a decolonizing directions for social transformation that is anti-capitalist and anti-colonials. So this is how I like to end, and then pass it on to Josh.